Thank you so much for coming to the Minnesota Transportation Museum's Adult Lecture Series. This is our third installment of the Adult Lecture Series, and I'm thrilled to see so many of the same faces and also new faces out there. Today we are welcoming Katie Barron, a fantastic historian and lawyer and at the Minnesota Streetcar Museum, a foreman and board member. She is incredibly knowledgeable. All of my conversations with her have been fantastic, and I cannot wait to hear what she shares with us today. So please join me in welcoming Katie Barron.
Hi folks, welcome in. So today we're going to be talking about women in the military. And one of the reasons why I am particularly interested in presenting this topic is because, well, it's very relevant today, but also too, it's Women's History Month. So let's celebrate that and let's dive further into how women got there between the bureaucratic process, the legislative process, basically how they got into it, and then physically how they got into it as well. The outline today, as I said beforehand, we're going to go through the legislative process, recruitment, induction and training, and transportation, so the physical transportation. So I want this to be a broad level overview of what's going on. It's not necessarily going to get into the weeds, but hopefully this is giving everyone a chance to look and see the information, maybe see this information for the first time, and then really get to the point where you can go back on your own and maybe take a look deeper if that's where you would like to go with this. So again, just a little introduction about me. BA in Political Science, Spanish, and Latin American Area Studies from the University of Minnesota Morris. I have a Juris Doctorate from William Mitchell College of Law. I am a living historian, a little bit more on that later. And I'm also a streetcar foreman and a board member at the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. Newly elected, might I add. But, yes. But so back to the living historian part. So the reason why I got into doing this is a couple of reasons, but mainly because I realized that as I was doing my research into history and just reading things in general, it wasn't alive for me. And I realized that as I was talking to other people, it wasn't really alive for them either. And so what Living History does is really give me an opportunity to present this information to you in a way that is both, eye-catching, shall we say, but also relatable. It really has gotten to the point where many of this generation are simply not here anymore. And I really think that I'm sort of at the tail end of the folks that do remember these people and will be old enough to remember these people by the time, I'm 80. And so at that point, realizing that, I really wanted to help bring this alive to the younger generations who don't remember the folks that I do, who don't have the grandparents that I did, and realistically are able to see this in a way, again, that makes an impact to them. So that's why I do what I do. Again, I don't necessarily have a degree in history, but I can research, given my Juris Doctorate there. So, the legislative process. We have to set the scene. This is in 1941, going into 1942, but let's bring it back even further, back to 1940. We're knowing that Hitler is now on the move in Europe. We know that Japan is making waves over in China. And suddenly the world is in turmoil. Suddenly, Pearl Harbor happens. Now the United States is really involved. And suddenly it became apparent to a lot of folks that we needed soldiers, sailors, Marines, and a lot of them real fast. But there was a problem. Let's not forget we had a standing military at the time. We had folks who were around who were trained in uniform, all of that. And suddenly we're thinking to ourselves, well, we've got men who can fight, we've got men who are trained to fight, but what happens to the logistics? That's where Edith North Rogers comes into play. Edith North Rogers was a congresswoman from the 4th District of Massachusetts, for the 4th Congressional District. And her fight was the beginning of getting women involved in the United States military. And just to preface this, this is John Hildreth, the general who was the Assistant Chief of Staff of the United States Army here. It was a battle. In my time, I've got some 100 bills through Congress, but this was more difficult than the rest of the 100 combined. And here is Representative Rogers. So what was going on at this point in time when we had Edith North Rogers talking to folks just sort of behind the scenes, just in general? She was really pulling on personal experience. She was part of the push in the First World War to become a volunteer. She volunteered with the YMCA. She volunteered with the Red Cross. This is really how she got involved with veterans issues. Her husband was the representative at the time. She was touring Europe with him, and she saw how the British women were involved in the war effort and how they were arm in arm with the men during their service. Now, this is something that in World War I in the United States, it was fairly rare and kind of a rare concept. We did have women who were serving the Yeomanettes and some Marinettes, but they were in on a technicality. In fact, the technicality was basically that it didn't stipulate that it had to be men who would join the military at that point, specifically the Navy. And so because of that, they slipped women in, and that was the reason why they were able to serve. But it wasn't official, and these women were not given veteran status. That's important, because veteran status is the way that you can claim the benefits and everything else that comes along with having served in the United States military and really being the equal of the men who also served. And Representative Rogers knew this. And so she said, we need to get women in there, but we need them in as legitimate participants of the military. And of course, she got pushback. So what ended up happening was her husband passes away in 1925, and she becomes an elected representative. She runs for her husband's seat. She becomes the longest serving female representative in the House until just recently, actually, until 2018. That really gave her the leverage that she needed to be able to introduce this bill. And on December 30th, 1941, the bill to introduce the WAAC, the WAC, was introduced in Congress. Her quote is such a wonderful quote here. In the beginning, I wanted very much to have these women taken in as part of the Army. I wanted them to have the same rate of pension and disability allowance. I realized that I could not secure that. The War Department was very unwilling to have these women as part of the Army. And that's where it sits. And so she knew, again, that she would have to present something that would be amenable to the War Department at this time. And that's where we get her initial bill with H.R. 4906. That comes in on May 28, 1941. There was a whole kerfluffle, obviously, about this. And the War Department was pushing back. And the War Department was basically saying, well, you know, we can't have folks do this, we can't have them uniform, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly it gets to the point where she says, all right, you know, I'll make some concessions. I'll make sure that we have auxiliary status really codified in here, which is not what she wanted, but it was what they were going to give her at the time, because this was just such a strange concept to them that they would have women introduced as equal members of the Army, that at this point they said, all right, you know, auxiliary status, meaning that they don't have necessarily the same benefits. They don't have the same status. Most of it's honorary, and in fact, their first leader was called a director instead of, you know, colonel or general or whatnot. And with that being said, they say, okay, that works for us. We've got January 28th, 1942, that passes the House Committee. So that was when they went through. The Rules Committee was really the one that was really pushing back, and that was really the fight that she experienced. March 17th, it passes the House. May 14th, it passes the Senate. And then May 15th, 1942, we see FDR sign off on Public Law 554, which is that act to establish the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. Now, a footnote here, just because, as I'm saying, this is just how they got there. Later on July 1st, 1943, the auxiliary will be dropped, and it will become the Women's Army Corps. And again, just to remind you, it is important to note that because this is when they went from unofficial members, sort of attached to the military, to the Army at this point, to full-fledged members, which meant that when they were out of the service, when they didn't need to re-up, or if they didn't want to re-up, they were given veterans benefits, they were given that pension, they were given that standing. That meant that they were really that full member of the United States military. And for that reason, again, that's really what Representative Rogers was talking about. And you can actually see it too. I have my small display here, just a little bit. But you can actually see the physical differences in the uniforms as well, just sort of as a tangent. One of them being, right here, you'll see that this is one of the khaki officer covers. This is called a hobby hat. I can talk more at length about that later. This is a little bit more tangential than I wanted to get into, but it's important. Notice this on top. Notice that hat badge. That's not a normal United States Army hat badge. That's not the eagle, as seen here. This is the eagle adjacent that they came up with, basically the walking duck. And the walking duck was something that they came up with in order to show, well, you know, we're military, we have a uniform, we have the trappings, but it's not necessarily the United States military. So again, showing that it's that auxiliary status to the military and to the Army specifically. And again, as well, with the uniform, the epaulets, normally we see them going across here. The epaulets on this uniform go up and down, again, as sort of a visual at a distance reminder of, oh, yeah, you know, she's in an Army uniform, but she's not necessarily the officer that I need to salute, per se. Another thing that's important to talk about, integration into the Army. So when we saw the introduction of the WAAC, that included Black women. So there was never a point in the Army when they said, we don't want Black women. This was actually also a very strange concept to the Army because they had segregated units in terms of segregated jobs for the Black soldiers. But for the WWII said, well, no, we're going to train them at the same place. They're going to be at equal partnership with the other women. And that was so revolutionary at the time, and of course, again, ruffled feathers, but they went ahead and pushed it through. And so at the top there you can see, this is sort of big now in the news, but with Charity Adams and the 6888, Charity Adams was at Fort Des Moines, and the rest of the gals were at Fort Des Moines when they were doing their training. They were training alongside the white women, and they were also eating in the same lunch halls. They were doing the same thing. Now, just because it was in the legislation that they were integrated didn't necessarily mean that all the women wanted to have the integration. And unfortunately, there were several instances of women, especially from the South, refusing to sit in the same lunch hall with them. There were also similar in the officer corps, the same problem where they had several women who were saying they didn't want to have Black women under them, but were told summarily, well, you walk away now, you can keep walking and get your papers. So there was a great amount of pushback to that sort of idea, and it really is a great story. I'm glad that we have a movie about that. It is very much worth a watch. Granted, there's a few things that I take issue with, But at the end of the day, it's great to have that story out there in the public eye. And then also, too, the Nisei WACs. So they were not allowed until November of 1943. So these are the Japanese descent American women. Of course, because once Pearl Harbor happened, we decided that they were enemies or potential enemies of the United States. But these ladies became imperative to the war effort because a lot of them had the knowledge of Japanese that was needed for the code breaking. And, important enough to Minnesota, they were stationed up in Minnesota, because Fort Snelling is where we had the language school, the military intelligence language school. Another reason for that is because Minnesota was basically the state that welcomed these folks, because we had both men and women, obviously, but it was one of the states, and if not the state, to be able to say, hey, we don't care, we'll welcome them. And so, therefore, Fort Snelling became the place where they were able to build that language school up, thus shortening the war because of their efforts with the code breaking. So since I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm talking primarily about the WAC in the beginning, but I'm also going to focus a little bit more on the waves as well. These are the two big branches I want to cover, just because they kind of have the story of the rest of the branches in terms of legislativeness or legislative journeys. But the creation of the waves was just as compelling, but even more of interest to how women were integrated. So December 9th, Representative Rogers is reaching out to Admiral Nimitz. And Admiral Nimitz is saying, you know, there's not really a need. We're okay. But that wasn't necessarily what the Department of the Navy thought. And so a little bit later on, in February of 1942, the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, recommends that the women be part of the Navy. Frank Knox is a very interesting person, a very fascinating person of his time, I would say, because he's very progressive in some ways and not so much in other ways. But he was instrumental in helping the Navy get women into the service. So not only was he instrumental, but also Margaret Chung. If you haven't heard of her, I would highly suggest looking into her history. She's also somebody that's not really well talked about, but she was sort of a friend of naval aviation. She herself was sort of a pioneer in the area. And then they also brought in someone from Minnesota, General Moss, who was a Marine aviator in World War I and has quite the military record himself. But he was also very amenable to having women in the Navy. And so he comes in and introduces this bill for women in the Navy in the House. Senator Raymond Willis of Indiana introduces a similar one in the Senate. And then we have pushback, because it can't be simple, right? It's never simple. So April 16th, 1942, the House Naval Affairs Committee recommends the Moss bill, and the House passes it. But when we talk about going into the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, especially the chairman, David Walsh of Massachusetts, opposes this bill because it would tend to break up American homes and would be a step backwards in the progress of civilization. Again, we just can't make it easy, can we? So the Senate is proposing a naval version of the WWII bill, the auxiliary bill. The FDR approves this. Why, again, is that important? Auxiliary status. They did not want the integration. But Frank Knox did. And so he said, no, this does not work. This does not work for us. This does not work for what the Navy needs. Let me talk to Eleanor Roosevelt. And so he did. And so Mrs. Roosevelt was kind enough to intervene on behalf of Knox and said, all right, yep, women in the Navy need to be full members of the Navy. And with that being said, with a little bit more shimmy with that July 30th, 1942, Public Law 689 is introduced and passed, is passed, and then the Naval Women's Reserve is created. The WWIIs, no auxiliary status, they come in as full-fledged members of the military. And so we also talk about integration here. As I said, Frank Knox is very much a product of his time as well. He did not want black women in the Navy. Now remember, the Navy at this time encompasses the Navy, the Marines, and a little bit about the Coast Guard. It's kind of a tangential thing, but he did have influence and he did have sway over there as well. So because of that, they actually had to wait till he had a heart attack. So he had a heart attack. And he dies. And right when he dies, we pick up Harriet Pickens and Frances Wills on December 26, 1944. They are brought in as the first two black female officers in the United States Navy. They are actually brought in 3 weeks late into midshipmen's school, and so they are forced to catch up with their classmates, but they do. Obviously, these were two very, very smart ladies. In fact, the WWIIs pretty much exclusively recruited from very intelligent women, from deans of colleges to educators and all of that, very highly educated women. And then they were able to join in, and they ended up in training with the Bronx. And then Olivia Hooker comes in the Coast Guard later in 1945 on March 9th. She was actually a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. So she was part of that story. And she ends up going on to be a pioneering psychologist later on, which is, again, another fabulous woman, very much worth a look into her history as well. So as I said, the other branches, we're just going to gloss over them a bit. The WRs, the Marines, they didn't get a fancy acronym because the Marines said, nope, they're just going to be Marines. That was authorized with the public law on July 30th, but they didn't officially become a branch until February 13th, 1943. The SPARS, the Coast Guard, Semper Paratus, always ready. That's going to be November 23rd, 1942. The WASPs. You've probably heard about the WASPs. Again, something kind of big in the culture right now. They don't become a thing until August 5th, 1943, when two branches were joined together. Now, I'd be remiss to say that these were the first women in the military, because they weren't necessarily. We did have our Navy nurses and our Army nurses coming in beforehand. The Army Nurse Corps is formalized in February 2nd, 1901. The Navy nurse, May 13th, 1908. So we're talking about, around World War I at that time. Recruitment. So this is getting into how they actually physically got in. In the Twin Cities, we're looking at the Roanoke building. So this is at 109 South 7th Avenue. It's still there. It doesn't look like that, but I promise you, it's still there. And they were at various floors of the Roanoke building here. This is how it looked in the 20s. This is kind of an approximation of how it looked in the 40s as well. Importantly, too, we do have a streetcar line that's very close, so of course the ladies would have jumped on the streetcar. A little bit more about that later. The eligibility requirements, kind of a list. Lady who would like to be enlisted, so no officer status, so basically just somebody with a high school diploma. She would be enlisted for the duration of the war, plus 6 months, must be an American citizen, at least 20 with parental consent, and up to 36, at least 5 feet tall and 95 pounds. I do know stories of women who are under 95 pounds, like it's, wow. Married women may enlist. providing that the husband is not part of the service that they're looking to get into. No dependents under 18. Good character, 3 references. 2 years of high school or business school, must pass the Navy physical. So this is specific to the Navy, but kind of encompasses the enlistment requirements for the other ladies as well. Must be able to hear a whispered word at 15 feet. Eyes can be corrected with glasses. There are ladies with glasses, and that's 20/20 vision. And then natural teeth or satisfactory replacements. I kind of love this one because it goes back to the whole Civil War thing where it's like you had to have your 2 front teeth, the 4 teeth, so that you could tear your cartridge belt or your pouch for your gunpowder and your round. So, and then in my book, I don't have it today, but in my book, one of the notes that the lady made was literally to underscore this. So I kind of have to wonder what her teeth were like. All right, so officers. Officers, of course, you're going to be a little bit older because you're going to have a degree. So a degree from an accredited college, or 2 years of college plus 2 years of acceptable business or professional experience. Physical is the same. Eyes, you've got your correctable. Teeth, they actually talk about having 18 sound teeth. So count. with specific molars and teeth. And then importantly on the bottom there, enlisted women could become officers. So you could become an officer in the Marines. They call this mustanging. And that means that after 6 months of service, you could apply to become an officer from that. So after you've applied, after you've gone through the exam, after you've done all of your sort of prerequisites and you've taken the oath of office, perhaps in the office itself, it's time for you to get there physically. And this is what we'll gloss over a bit more here. So this is a great picture. I love this, except that it's not necessarily Twin Cities related. This is actually Waves attending school over in New York City in the Bronx. But I kind of really enjoy this picture just because I do enjoy that subway. Welcome to talking about the TCRT, the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company. Yeah. So at this point in time, of course, streetcars are becoming your basic way of travel within the cities. So I would be remiss if I didn't say that streetcar traffic just in general or usage was going down by the time World War II hits. And that's for a couple different reasons, but the big one is, of course, the automobile. Everybody is very interested in getting their own cars, and we're becoming a more car-dependent society. But the transportation by streetcar is still very robust. We still have right around 500 miles of track. We are the most comprehensive, or one of the most comprehensive systems in the United States still. And our fleet is well maintained. That's super important because once World War II hits, and once we are getting into rationing with rubber, rationing with gas, and just not having the sort of resources that a car-dependent society requires, streetcars become a huge part of the way you get around. So what we talk about, or what we see here with this up here, and I'm trying to get them to do this, but they're telling me that it's too expensive. But this is a wrap on one of our bodies. This is our bond drive body. There were 2 of these that were running around the Twin Cities, and this was actually a very common way to advertise, to do various different war things. This one, of course, is specifically to buy bonds, but I have seen that streetcars in other cities were talking about joining the Waves. There was a specific Waves one. Again, something that I'm hopefully going to get some advertisement on 1300, but we'll see. But so that's kind of something that you would have seen. Of course, our normal bodies would have been the same. And also kind of as a tangent to this, we're introducing the motorettes in 1943 in July. So at the time, if you're trying to join the military, or if you're looking at joining the military, this is also talking about that you had other options to go about joining the war effort. So it wasn't just about joining the military. You could have perhaps become a motorette. But a lot of times when the women talk about joining the military, they said, you know, it was their patriotic duty, that they felt called to, you know, see the world, because of course a lot of these women wouldn't have been able to see the world otherwise. And other things just that drove them to, you know, go beyond the domestic here. But that's not to say that, you know, the gals who joined and did the motorettes were not patriotic. We needed these ladies too. So it really does show how much of an all-out effort this was in order for us to be able to win the war. Also too, at this point in time with the streetcar system, you would have seen a bit of staggering. I'm just going to show you. So folks who know our station might remember or might see this and find this familiar, because this is our Linden Hills station over at the Como Harriet streetcar line. A little bit bigger because that's the chalet that was there instead of our little station from the 1908 version, circa 1908 version. But you would have been seeing more frequent streetcars. You would have been seeing them kind of more staggered. You would have seen them all night. Owl service gets introduced at this time. And that's the reason for that is because a lot of the young men who were joining were working third shift, like whether that be at Schmidt Brewing or Northern Pump or whatever. And folks were realizing that, you know, they were trying to get these men in and inducted into the Army at any point in time. You couldn't do that if you didn't have the all-night service. And so because there was that need to make sure these men would get to Fort Snelling to be able to join the war after their shift, that was when owl service was introduced. So that's why you see that increase in traffic there. I really love this image here. This is down at Chicago. This is the WWII band. So coming in and doing a parade. What I presume is the middle of the day. I haven't necessarily found the entire backstory of this, but it's by the New England Furniture Company building. But as you can see, we've got a Chicago Penn streetcar right behind, and presumably there's other streetcars behind as well. They tended to back up whenever there was an obstruction on the line. But so you can just kind of see this is kind of how life would have been in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but for this example, Minneapolis back then, just kind of as a example too of a recruitment tool, because the band was obviously a good way to recruit and to drive folks to recognize that the WWII was part of the Army as well at this point. They would have been fully integrated at this point too. And here is the streetcar system, specifically from 1933, but we are working right around with the same lineage at the time of World War II happening. And so again, just kind of driving home the point of this is how comprehensive this system was. And when you look at the way that our cities are laid out, you can actually see the streetcars and how that system was laid out. And also too, when you really look at it, if you see streets in town that are extra wide, that seem to be sort of, you know, bigger than normal, you can rest assured that that's probably streetcars. But you can see also too, if you lived in St. Paul, all you'd need to do is to jump the line, maybe Como Harriet, maybe your Selby Lake, be able to get over, do a few transfers, get into downtown Minneapolis, and you could head straight to that Roanoke building. You really did not need to worry about a car. And in fact, a lot of the women, of course, joining probably wouldn't have had that car available to them, since whoever had the car was probably off at the war work as well. Like the streetcars, trains, passenger trains specifically, really took the brunt of the travel when it came to transporting anything from troops to people just in general, to supplies. We had, of course, the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant. So a lot of times it wasn't just the folks that were joining that were on these military trains. We were going to be seeing also the movement of cargo as well. The military railroad service was in charge of the railroad service, conveniently. But we had a branch of that at Fort Snelling, So they were able to coordinate the trains coming in and out of the cities, and also too, just sort of in the general area, just because Minneapolis-St. Paul was, I would say, one of the bigger areas for war effort until you really get to Chicago. So you have that sort of transportation. You've got Milwaukee, of course, but that's, of course, over on that side. And then, of course, you have Duluth. So Duluth Superior is really an engine of war production at that time. So we have to have that central office here that can conduct business, and that's where they picked Fort Snelling to be for the military railroad service. So I really like this map because it shows sort of an overview, a 40,000 foot overview of what it would look like to take the trains at this point in time. So for the ladies who are joining the WWII, from here, we're looking at going to Des Moines. That's probably going to be, for passenger service, the Rock Island passenger service. Obviously, we have other trains that could potentially take that, but this is where that is going to go through. It's going to go through Mason City, and we're going to hit Des Moines from there. Now, if you're going into the waves have a couple different areas, but if you're going to go to the Cedar Falls area, you're going to be taking over here, and that's probably going to be the CBQ. But again, that's just coming from Twin Cities. This is kind of presupposing that you've gotten your orders to go to these specific places. You could have been sent anywhere. So at this point, if you were told, all right, well, you're going to be, sent down to Florida to go through Coast Guard training school. I mean, obviously, you're going to be taking a lot of transfers there, but this is generally the conglomeration of rail service that would get you there. And where would you go? So we have our big three that I'm going to talk about. Not to say that there weren't others, but these are kind of our big three, of course, that ladies would be headed to. So by 1944, we have 186 passenger trains arriving and departing from our much beloved St. Paul Union Depot. It's interesting because I actually had a hard time finding a lot of photos from the era just sort of online in the ether, which I found very fascinating. So obviously there's photos out there, but it was very interesting that we didn't have necessarily the plethora of images that you'll see from a city like St. Louis, because 186 trains, I mean, that's not small business that we're doing up here. But of course, this is home to our CBQ, our Burlington, Chicago Great Western, the Milwaukee Road, Chicago Rock Island Pacific, the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Louis, the Soo Line, Northern Pacific, and then of course our Great Northern. So any one of those railroads in any sort of capacity could have been helping there. I also love our Minneapolis Great Northern Depot. Now, this is one that folks might not necessarily know about if you haven't necessarily done a lot of research about the trains in Minneapolis, but this is where we have about 125 daily trains arriving, departing by 1944. And this is where you're going to have, again, that CBQ, Chicago Northwestern, Chicago Great Western, Northern Pacific, Great Northern. And it's interesting, too. I guess I didn't necessarily realize that the Stone Arch Bridge was meant to service a prior station in this area, but ended up servicing this station. A little bit of information on my end, I guess. I had always suspected something was like that, but I didn't have the confirmation. I love this picture too because, of course, it shows our streetcar. And again, a great illustration of how easy it would have been for these women in Minneapolis to jump that streetcar system and head straight to the depot. And then last but not least, our Milwaukee Road Depot. Obviously, the Milwaukee Road is on the streetcar line as well. Rock Island, again, is probably going to be where you're going to be taking the most to go to Fort Des Moines that I was able to find. If it's not a specific military transportation, this was going to be your passenger. And I love that 261 was built in 1944. That really does go to show that we were not using diesel at that time. We were using our steam trains. And that was because of rationing. Again, rationing hit us on so many areas that going back to using what we would consider maybe archaic technology really came in handy, that we had that sort of breadth of ability to sort of lateral move in our transportation system. And in fact, a lot of the women, when they talk about the trains that they took, they talk about them being old. They talk about them being rickety. They talk about them being something from the 1800s. They talk about them being sooty and uncomfortable and bumpy. But it got them there. And realistically, it was what was needed to be able to do the domestic work. And of course, the work abroad as well, once we started sending the locomotives over to France in order to start moving the stuff over there, the war work over there. Alrighty, so with that being said, I think I've ended it with about 5 minutes to the talk, but thank you so much for joining and listening in today. Leah. So the question was about when I referenced my book. So my book was referenced to Guide Right. So Guide Right was the manual for the waves and the spars when it came to not only what needed to be done to get into the military, but also going forward, what needed to be done when it came to your uniform specifications, how to care for your uniform, how to comport yourself, those various different things. For the guys, they called it the Blue Jacket Manual. This was meant to be sort of an addendum to that, but it became its own piece, its own book. And they're about yay big or so, not very long in terms of the information, but it is all female specific. And again, that was brand new to the military at the time. So the ladies in the WWII had their own version. The Waves sort of famously had Guide Right. And then you would have seen various other books or various other memorandums for the other branches as well. Other questions?
I have a comment.
Yes.
Did you know that our Dan Patch over there during the war served Northern Pump and was painted red, white, and blue with 5 war bonds on it? I'll send you a picture.
That is utterly fabulous.
Yeah.
I was just over at Northern Pump. Okay, so fun story about that. I didn't know necessarily about Northern Pump until I actually went to the antique store and I found the pictures that they had commissioned of all of the boats that were around. And I was like, Northern Pump Company? So that led me down the rabbit hole. And then one day I'm at this brewery drinking a beer and suddenly it occurs to me, well, that looks familiar. And so that is where I ended up figuring out about Northern Pump. And then also too, in the book about Minnesota during the war, talks a little bit more about the guy who was behind Northern Pump, and that's just an interesting story. A side note to that too, the trolleys also, we had a couple that were renovated and also similarly painted, patriotic and such, to service over there. And they had 2 waves that were there who christened the trolleys with the champagne bottles. Again, something that I don't know the shop folks will let me do over at 1300, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Other questions? All right, yes.
I'm interested in your uniform that you're wearing.
Yes, my uniform. So my uniform is a WWII uniform. So I'm a private, as you can tell. So this is actually a local veteran. The story of this is very fascinating because it actually fell into my lap, unlike a lot of the other items that I have here. Our friend was saying, oh, I have a skirt that might fit you. And suddenly he brings over this skirt and I'm like, oh yeah, Bob, that's a WWII skirt. And he's like, oh, I've got other stuff too. He pulls out the full uniform, coat included, and I'm like, I've known you for how long, Bob? Where have you been keeping this from me? The story goes is back in the day, he went to an estate sale. And it was this lady and her husband, apparently, who had passed on, and she's buried at Fort Snelling. And this is her uniform. And it fit me almost to like a glove at that point. And so it was really cool because it was very much meant to be in a lot of ways. And so I'm very proud to have it. So she's part of the Transportation Corps. And so I haven't necessarily been able to track down her full service record because her DD-214 is not necessarily for public view. I'm hoping to try to track it down a bit more. Excuse me. But so Transportation Corps WWIIs would have been part of the logistics behind moving any sort of war material, people, various different things at our ports. They would have been primarily working again at the ports, so they probably would have been at, at somewhere in New York City, over in Virginia, maybe even overseas. A couple of them went overseas as well to work with the Transportation Corps. Actually, too, there were also nurses who were part of the organization as well. It was actually a fairly big part, again, logistical part of the war that a lot of folks seem to gloss over because I hadn't really heard about them until I had gotten into reenacting. But yeah, this would have been a very vital part of the war effort, of course, logistical maneuvering. So yeah, that was her story. Yes.
My mother-in-law was a WWII, and when she passed away several years ago, she's at Fort Snelling, and they did give her the full military honors with the flyover and the 21-gun salute and everything. So
yep.
It's nice that the Navy did honor her
yes.
in every bit of ways that they did.
Yep, and eventually the WWII and everyone else were honored as veterans as well. Again, there was a little bit of pushback, especially immediately following the war, just because of the political climate at the time. But it's nice that we got to the point where once they started passing away, funerals with military honors, veterans benefits, survivors benefits, that was all accorded to the women. Because yeah, with the women, if they were in the WAAC when they were overseas, if they had died, their family didn't get anything. So they wouldn't have been given survivors benefits. They wouldn't have been given any sort of that, any sort of the things that would traditionally be accorded to a soldier if he was killed overseas. And that was one of the things that really drove folks to say, hey, we can't have them be auxiliary anymore, because if they're going overseas, and we have clearly found the need for these women overseas, and they are clearly doing a great job, they can't just be left out to dry. And Director Hobby, Colonel Hobby, who is the first director to colonel of the WWII, she was a fabulous person in terms of being able to be so politically astute, politically adroit, that she was really barging into the right rooms, and she was really holding her own, and she was able to do that in a way that was both not necessarily confrontational and mean, but she got her point across. And so she was very much that strong type of person that could do that, and that was why she was such a great choice for the leadership there. And the same with McAfee as well. McAfee was the leader for the Waves, and she was also of that same persuasion. And also too, Dorothy Stratton. I mean, they all were, but Dorothy Stratton is really cool for domestic reasons because she was originally stationed over at UW-Madison. And she was part of the radio school. She was part of the head of the radio school over there that was training the Waves at the radio school. And they pulled her from Madison to lead the spars. So she was also a very interesting and competent woman, but I do love knowing that bit of the history is over so close to us, because that was where the Waves got to train, at Madison. So Grandma was a WWII. I should say that she wasn't necessarily it wasn't that she wasn't proud of being a WWII, but she never talked about it. And my mom, or my dad never, my dad never talked about it because he never heard about it. She was never open with it. And of everybody that we've talked about in our family, I mean, we knew the stories of my uncles. We knew, my uncle in the Pacific. We knew all of that. And yet Grandma served, and yet it was just sort of glossed over. And it was weird because she also, too, was very pioneering. She was a nurse anesthetist. She was out there. She was actually the family breadwinner. And again, this was just kind of a part of her life that we never got to talk about. And she passed before I was even 6. So I didn't even get to be an adult and talk to her about it. So it was just very interesting. I knew that Grandma had a white headstone growing up, but didn't necessarily understand the significance of that. So I did find her DD-214, so we'll be doing a little bit more research into that and trying to get her story and perhaps get her uniform also recreated to a certain extent. Great question. So the question is that did the women who were serving in the WAAC, once it became the WAC, did they get automatic integration into the service? They had to rejoin. So that was one of those things that they said there was kind of this break period between once the law was passed and once the WWII became a thing in September. And they told all the ladies, they said, all right, you want to be part of the WWII, we're going to need you to rejoin. And over 70% of them did. So this was not a deal breaker for over 70%. And that, at the time, was almost breathtaking in its scope of women who really wanted to be part of this. Yes?
Did they keep their rank, or were they running the up?
Yes. Yep. So for the most part, they did keep their rank. But things like I said with Colonel Hobby, Director Hobby became Colonel Hobby because she could finally be accorded the honor that came with the honorific rank that she was given. So you would finally be able to refer to her as Colonel Hobby. But beforehand, that wasn't necessarily the case. But yeah, you just lateraled over to the same rank that you were at that time. And then you worked within the structure. And then, of course, if you were an officer, you got saluted by the men just as you would the women at the time. So it's one of those things that's even the playing field for everyone at that point. And it is interesting because I have seen that when folks go through and when we talk about discharging and getting out of the WAAC, I almost wonder, because I know that they didn't necessarily receive the benefits then. I have to look and see if there's a retroactive application to that, or if that was part of the contract that they just sort of forewent the veterans benefits as they got out. Because there were a couple gals that, of course, got pregnant and whatnot, left because of that. Honorable discharges, but not necessarily the benefits given to them. And we should talk about that slander campaign just a little bit. There was a slander campaign. It was quite pervasive. There was a very big slander campaign about these gals being loose women, any bad thing you can think of, take your pick. That's what they were called. And they really did have to fight back, because you do see in the training manuals, you do see them talk about things like alcohol. And for the WWII, it wasn't necessarily looked at as a good thing for you to be out on the town, having drinks, in uniform, all of this. In the waves, you were allowed to drink as long as it was appropriate. You were allowed to, do that, but there is really that pervasive look of you had to maintain a certain aesthetic and you had to maintain a certain decorum while you were in uniform. And that was in the direct fire for, the public, because if they saw you drunkenly teetering across the road, of course, you're just fitting the slander campaign. And they really wanted to try their best to make sure that these women were the polar opposite of what was being slung at them. So that's part of that. All right, I think we're about at time. Any other questions last minute? All right, well, thank you so much again, everyone. Really appreciated it.